Today we are entering the world of greens, specifically a lot of spring greens. In the following videos, I'm going to show you how to identify some of the very common spring greens. I'm going to show you how to correctly wash, handle, and store your greens. And then I'm also going to show you some ways to cook greens. Let's begin by a quick identification of some of the greens that I have in front of me here. We get all of our greens from a local farm in Boulder, J Hill Farms, and what we've done here is I pulled out what they consider to be their spring green mix, and I pulled some aside because I wanted to show you all so you can start to identify some of the greens at home and how to correctly use them. These are most of them are lettuces, most of them are sweet and tender, not a lot of bitterness, not a lot of fibrous leaf to contend with. So these are all greens that will be very appropriate to keep raw. Toss them all together. A simple light vinaigrette will be lovely with them. What we have here, and you've probably all seen something like this. This is just very straightforward green leaf lettuce. Some of these are smaller than normal because they're doing some baby lettuces. Again, this is red leaf, very similar to the green leaf, but the red version. Here I have some baby romaine, really pretty with a little red around the edges. This is something you all probably have seen and deal with a lot, basic spinach. This is red oak. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between basic red leaf and red oak. If you actually look at one of these leaves, pull it apart, it does resemble an oak leaf, hence the name red oak. And then one of my favorite lettuces, I just have a few big pieces, the outer pieces of the head, and this is called butter lettuce. Almost just like butter as far as the texture goes. Really delicate, almost kind of sweet, very lovely to use whole. As you can see, these are all of the tender, sweet lettuces. And then behind, I have some very common lettuces that are pretty popular these days. This is arugula. As many of you know, it has that nice peppery mustard spice. And then this is a green that is very similar to arugula. This is called Mizuna. Mizuna actually is a little less mild than arugula. And to tell the difference, if I hold these both up, you can see the Mizuna actually has jagged leaves. The Mizuna, although it's a little, looks a little more angry than the arugula, is actually a little less peppery. So it's a little more mild. The arugula has more of the round leaf on the top. These two are wonderful to toss in with the rest of the spring mix that I've identified here. It's going to give you a little more interest in your mix. A little peppery bite here and there is really nice. As far as now that we know how to basically identify some of these greens, washing, storing is incredibly important. These greens have not been washed. They've been cut on the farm, brought to us. We keep them as dry as possible in the cooler until we're ready to use them. And that's when I introduce water. I never want to introduce water too soon in the game. Water obviously will help if it's cold, crisp, or refresh our greens. It also can do some damage to our greens. It can actually cause them to break in half, which will bruise them. They'll become wilted, that type of thing. So keep the water off until right before you are going to use them. Keep them dry in the cooler. Keep them in the bag they've come in, or if they're in a box, keep them in the box. Over here, I have a nice combination of some greens that are very appropriate for braising, steaming, sautéing. Any of those methods will work beautifully. I have a combination of greens here. These, which are sticking out and quite obvious, this is rainbow chard. Beautiful color on these greens. All different colored stalks on the chard that go up into the dark green leaf. If you have the option in the market, at the farmer's market, I prefer looking for the smaller leaves. So more of the baby varieties of any of these lettuces are going to be a little more tender. So look for the smaller, but again, take advantage of the color that this rainbow chard has. I never would just cut it off and compost all the stalk. I would actually use the stalk, maybe trim it around right where my fingers are. It starts to get a little fibrous from here down. Trim it there, and then mince it and mix it in with the top green, just because I want to take advantage of that really beautiful color. Again, this is all rainbow chard. Next to the rainbow chard, we have some beet greens, just the top of beets. A lot of people love beets, and this will come looking something like this on the top of your bundle of beets. Don't get rid of these. Save these. These are just as tasty as something like chard and incredibly good for you. So I trim my beets off, which we've done here. We've roasted our beets. These you can then quickly wilt in a saute pan, braise them, eat them alone, or reintroduce them to the rest of your beets. It's going to add color into those beets. It's also going to add some really nice flavor and some very good nutrition for you. These small little leaves here are the top of radishes. So again, I love radishes on the bottom. I also love radish tops. Save your radish tops. These are actually tender enough to just eat raw, or they work beautifully if you toss them together and just call it a general braising mix. And then I don't have any here, but turnip greens are another example of something that I would never get rid of. Save the tops of your turnips as well and use them just as I've been talking about, certainly how I use the beet greens. What I've done here in this large bowl of water is mixed all three types of greens here. These greens are a little more fibrous, not quite as tender as any of these greens, so I want to braise these. I like to mix them all together. I'll break them down all to, big bites because they are mostly water, and as soon as they hit heat in a pan, they're going to lose a lot of their volume, so they're going to shrink quite a bit. So keep them large, and this is definitely the best way to wash all greens. Get a large bowl of cold water. Make sure your greens actually are floating in there. What will happen is the greens will float to the surface, and the dirt or the grit, the sand, whatever happens to be, will fall to the bottom of the bowl. So I am just giving it a nice little bath with my hands. I turn it around, make sure I'm not feeling any grit or sand up in the top. And then I have my trusty green salad spinner dryer contraption, and I'm going to spin these greens dry. So I'm letting that water, most of the water, fall off. I'm going to transfer them into my spinner, and we're going to spin them dry. The reason I like to spin my greens, and this goes for any green that I'm washing, fresh herbs, things like that, is if you try to do it any other way, you're most likely going to be bruising your greens. So if I were going to be throwing these greens into a towel and doing this kind of motion on top of the greens, blotting them dry, what I'm actually doing is creasing them. Every single crease that I'm giving to these greens, it's going to bruise them. So avoid this. It's very important to dry your greens, regardless of what you're doing, but avoid that actual drying with a towel. I'm going to use the spinner to throw the water off of my greens. So what's left in my bowl is a lot of dirt. It's fallen to the bottom, and that's exactly what I'm looking to do. Lid goes on, and then at this point in time, this contraption acts as a centrifuge, so it's spinning all the water off my greens. I'll do it a few times, lift it up and make sure it's actually doing the job. I want to make sure these are dry. Yes, these are going into a pan to be braised. It's not as critical as drying your greens if you're going to be tossing them in a vinaigrette, but it is critical to dry as much as you possibly can. The reason I stress the importance of drying with a vinaigrette is, as you all know, oil and water do not mix. So if you have wet greens and you introduce a vinaigrette, you know the vinaigrette's going to slide right off the leaf, and you're going to have that lovely puddle of dressing in the bottom of your bowl, which we do not like. My greens are nice and dry now. I can lift them out, let that extra water run off, and this mix is ready for braising.